Good morning, everyone. I'm Richie Brayman. I'm with the University of Georgia's Center for Urban Agriculture. The center supports this webinar technology from UGA Extension and would like to introduce you to the host of this webinar series. Dr. Dan Suter is a professor of urban pest management in the Department of Entomology at the University of Georgia. He's located on the UGA Griffin campus. Dr. Suter has worked with the pest control industry since 1987. He'd like to welcome you and introduce you to our speaker.
Well, thank you, Richie, and welcome everyone. Dr. Matthew Chappell's program at the University of Georgia focuses on serving the green industry both in Georgia and across the globe through the development of an applied research and extension program in the areas of nursery management and nursery production. He currently serves as the co-chair of the Georgia Green Industry Association Educational Subcommittee and is the UGA Horticulture Department liaison to the Center for Applied Nursery Research located in Deering, Georgia. He is also editor of Ball Publishing's Nursery and Landscape Insider newsletter, which currently has over 28,000 subscribers. Wow. And it's free, so Matthew would invite you to please join up. So you'll have to, at some point, Matthew, let folks know how they can join up to get that free newsletter. So welcome, Dr. Chappell, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dan. Real quick, just do a final sound check to make sure everyone can hear me.
Yeah, you sound great, Matthew.
Sound great, Matthew.
Thanks, guys. Well, what I was asked to speak on today is something that I get frequent requests for, and that is how do we troubleshoot landscape problems. And I like to tackle this issue from a bit of a different perspective. And that perspective is generally, a lot of you would say, well, yeah, that just makes common sense. But it's a series of best management practices that if you follow them from a cultural standpoint and understanding the interaction of plant and the environment in which we put the plant in, it will go a long way into troubleshooting a lot of the plant problems that are really more secondary to issues with a plant not being able to adapt to the environment that it's placed in, or things like improper planting, improper fertilization. So if we get the cultural practices right, then we're a lot less likely to have to worry about problems such as disease or insect pressure that oftentimes are secondary to the plant being stressed in the first place. So that's kind of what I'm going to build on today, and then Dr. Woodward will follow me and talk about a lot of the disease issues. So one thing that you have to remember, a predecessor of mine, Dr. Gary Wade, said this to me very frequently, and it is definitely true. I have been in this role as extension specialist now for 10 years, and I can definitely say that the vast majority of our issues, the things that we have to troubleshoot, are due to a lack of the plant's ability to adapt to where we put it in the landscape, okay? And it could be a cold hardiness issue, it could be a heat tolerance issue, it could be drought tolerance, it could be a shade plant that's put into too much sun, or the reverse. But most problems that we deal with focus on the fact that we're putting the plant into an improper environment. So we're setting that plant up to fail. And really, one of the first things you have to look at, and I know that I am guilty of this because I love pushing the boundaries, and any good plant nerd or plant geek is going to want to push the boundaries. A great example for me are palms. I am going to plant any palm that I can, and I watch them die year after year. Not last winter because we failed to have a winter, but in a normal winter, I lose almost all my palms except for needle palm and windmill palm. And that's because those are the two which are cold hardy in my area, which is Athens, Georgia. Okay, if you're in South Georgia, you may be able to grow more, or if you're in Florida or Southern Alabama. And as you get farther north, you can grow less and less of the palms. It's very interesting. I have a gentleman that I speak to frequently who's a palm guru on Long Island, New York, who goes to great lengths so that he can grow palms. But for most of us in most managed landscapes, we don't have the ability to cater to a single plant unless it is a specimen tree or specimen shrub. Rather, we really need to be successful, pick plants that are hardy to the zone in which they're planted. So I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago now, the plant hardiness zone maps were updated. You can see Georgia's here. So in the Atlanta area, we're on that 8A, 7B cusp, and that's what most of Georgia falls into now is zone 8, whether it's zone 8A or 8B, the exception being up toward the mountains and then far down toward the coast and St. Mary's River. So what we need to do is we need to properly pick plants that have good cold hardiness, because if we pick a plant for a landscape that is not cold hardy, oftentimes you get winter injury due to cold damage, and then you'll get things like disease or insect pressure that comes in because those are secondary issues. So this time of year is when you'll see a disease come in, and you might not notice the damage, the cold damage, because it could be microscopic split bark, for example. And then now in the middle of the summer, you notice, oh, well, I have a disease issue. That disease issue is actually directly related to the cold damage, which you may not have even seen. And that cold damage is because you probably picked a plant that wasn't good in that hardiness zone. That's just one example. There are generally two things that we have to consider when it comes to landscapes. And there are two general ways that you can avoid plant-related problems. If you have a new site, you have to select plants that are adapted to the site. When the economy is booming, landscape contractors are putting in lots of houses. We generally have much more of these clean slate type of landscape issues. When the economy isn't doing as well, when we're in a recession, you have a lot of people that are buying existing homes. Not a lot of new home construction is going on. In those cases, a lot of the questions that I have and a lot of our extension questions are based on how to manage existing sites. And oftentimes, the best way or the easiest way is actually changing the site to fit the plants that are already there. And a great example of this is tree removal. Now, I'm not a fan of tree removal unless it's a sweet gum. You can cut all those down your heart desires. But otherwise, I'm not necessarily a fan of tree removal. But oftentimes, particularly in mature neighborhoods, tree removal is oftentimes the only mechanism by which we can get sun into a landscape, and particularly if you want color beds, so annuals and perennials that require more sun to bloom well, it's really your only option. So you have to consider those two facets as part of the landscape plan. And you also need to step back and look at what you have. And this is just a picture of a lot of the things that if you take into account, and it's almost like taking an inventory or site analysis before you ever think about planting a plant, it will get you a long way down the road of avoiding problems in the future. Just some things here in the top left corner, and I'll see if I can use this pencil feature. You have your winter winds. Okay, that is going to be a desiccating type of a wind, particularly for leaf evergreen shrubs. Tend to see more winter damage, particularly when we stay below freezing for a long period of time. So you would want to plant those somewhere where you don't have that winter wind effect. So maybe on the other side of the house, so the south and the eastern side of the house, may be better for planting things like broadleaf evergreen shrubs versus the north and west side of a house. You have things like slope, okay? Obviously, gravity will pull all things down. It's one of my favorite Elmer Fudd quotes, but one of those two things that a lot of people don't consider is using slope to your advantage when planting or selecting plants. So plant heavier water use type plants at the bottom of the slope, something like a hydrangea, but also fertilizer. Fertilizer, most of it is pelletized, and most of it is going to run downhill, particularly if you have a clay soil. So heavier water use, but also heavier feeding plants generally do better at the base of a slope. And this is particularly true in non-irrigated landscapes, although it still does hold true even if you irrigate. Because as we all know, when it rains in Georgia in the summer, it really rains generally. We don't have summer showers here. And the same holds true for much of the eastern United States. So those plants with heavier water use and heavier fertilizer use, they do much better at the base of that slope. Understand things like your existing trees, as well as are they deciduous trees or are they conifers or broadleaf evergreens, because that's going to determine what plant material that you can use under those. Things like one of the biggest things or issues that I get deals with power lines. Most people are too busy looking down at their phones to look up and actually see there's a power line. So what ends up frequently happening is people will plant trees directly into power lines. Well, if you'd like free pruning from your electrical member co-op or Georgia Power, that's a great idea, but otherwise it might not be good for the structure of that tree or the aesthetics of your landscape to have a flat top tree right next to your home. So pay attention to where these things are, and then you don't have to worry about troubleshooting the issue down the line. Slopes, I had mentioned, swales are just a different terminology for a slope or a downward area. But other things that you have to just generally pay attention to, one of the big issues that I see frequently, glare off of pavement, particularly in suburban areas. And this is more so as not only glare, but also heat. But the heat is more of a blacktop versus concrete issue, even though concrete gets hot as well. But if you're planting something like azaleas or loropetalums, or particularly these broadleaf evergreen shrubs near the pavement, oftentimes you get either heat damage during the summer, or during the winter you can actually get sun scald on the foliage. So it's something else to pay attention to. But just make sure that you take a complete site inventory. That is the key to understanding or preventing these problems to begin with. You probably heard this a million times, but testing the soil is key. What I find very interesting, particularly in clay-based soils, oftentimes you don't even need to fertilize every year, and yet people do it every year. So generally, I would say $30 worth of soil tests, because you probably need to submit multiple samples, but let's say $30 to $50 worth of soil tests oftentimes can save you $500 or more in fertilizer costs, because it may not be needed every year. Just as an example, my home landscape, I fertilize based on soil test results roughly every 3 to 4 years. I may adjust the pH by liming, but I actually don't need to apply a fertilizer product. So that's something that that you can avoid issues with, or you can actually avoid costs there. The other thing is, and we'll talk about this more when I describe fertilizer issues, but if you over-fertilize, you're actually setting the plant up to be a magnet, more or less, for insect issues, particularly aphid issues, as well as there's actually some interesting research that came out of, I think it was Mississippi State or Texas A&M, I don't remember, where deer delivery on fertilized plants is actually greater than non-fertilized plants. So you can actually, in some cases, set yourself up for issues that you didn't even anticipate. But really insects, as well as if you're fertilizing and irrigating heavily and you have lush new growth, you can also, that can be more susceptible to some disease issues, although I will let Gene Woodward tell you more about that later. And again, most of you have seen the soil test report, so I won't harp on that. But pH, and particularly in clay soils in northern Georgia, is a much larger issue year to year with reductions in soil pH than is fertility. Now, if you're south of the fall line and you're in more sandy soils, you may need to fertilize each and every year, but in those areas, pH doesn't seem to be quite such an issue. And if it is, oftentimes it's a the fact that you need to reduce your soil pH with something like aluminum sulfate rather than raise it with something like lime or gypsum. But you can also actually pick plants that are suited for certain pH ranges. If you know you have a consistently low soil pH, like if you're in a clay soil in northern part of the state, you can pick plants, and a lot of them are ericaceous plants, things like azalea, rhododendron, Ilia, that do better at lower soil pH. Or if you would like to have a blue hydrangea, lower soil pH. Then you have a separate group of plants that does better at higher pH. So understanding your plant choices and developing lists of plants, particularly if you're a landscape contractor, having lists of plants that do well in certain environments is going to go a long way into your clients, or if it's your home landscape, you yourself, having less troubleshooting issues down the road and being much more pleased with the results. One thing when it comes to pH, which in field soils, and by field soils I mean clay to sand, landscape soils, pH is critically important, mainly due to nutrient availability. And a lot of you have seen this. We really want our soil pH to be between 5.2 and 6.5. The biggest reason why that is, it's not necessarily that's the pH where the plant is healthiest. It is that that's the pH at which the nutrients are available in the soil, or nutrients are available to the plant in the soil. So that's why we want that pH range right in there. So again, right plant in the right place. I am a big proponent of lists, and it's not only because I'm obsessive compulsive and moderately ADHD. I just like lists in general. I blame my mother for making me write lists as a child. But if you make these lists of plants, and I have lists that go down to, for example, full sun plants that are drought tolerant, that are low fertility plants. So if a client calls me, if a county extension faculty calls me, or a homeowner or a landscape contractor, and they give me that list of criteria, it's all in an Excel spreadsheet, and I just open the Excel spreadsheet, and within 10 seconds, I can give you 10 plants. What it does is it makes me look much smarter than I actually am. And if you're a landscape contractor, I suggest that you make similar lists, because it's going to make you look much smarter than you probably are too. That's what lists do for us. But you know, there are many things. There's drought tolerant versus heavy water users. There's high fertility, low fertility. There's sun versus shade, water requirements. There are many lists of plants, and by using or assessing the site and then understanding and having the correct plants, you're not going to run into nearly as many troubleshooting issues as you would otherwise. And then grouping plants is another thing that we should do. We should group plants that have similar needs based upon the inputs that we're willing to give. For example, if it's an irrigated landscape and water is not going to be an issue unless they turn the water off in significant droughts, but if water generally is not an issue, then maybe you would want to create a list and utilize plants from that list that are more based upon light requirements and less based upon water requirements. So understand the site and what's available to you, and this is particularly true with irrigation and light, but other factors as well, and then only use plants from those lists. This is a good example. This is a post property in Atlanta, and this picture was taken quite some time ago, but it's still very good. This is a swale. So this is the top of the hill, and at the bottom of the hill, the elevation changes about 30 to 40 feet, I would guess. So you have an area, a turf area, that the water runs downhill, okay? But at the top of the hill, you have things like sedums and achillea, miscanthus, things that don't require as much water, some asters. When you get down to the bottom of the hill, and it's hard to see down here, but the plant palette changes to plants that require more water. I would say water hogs, A lot of people like that term, but they require much more water, and it's because this is an unirrigated landscape. It's well maintained, but it's unirrigated. And for that reason, they've picked this palette of plants that slowly transitions from the top of the hill, where it's generally drier. These dry, I would say, drought tolerant plants down the hill to plants that are much more, much less prone to, or much more prone to drought injury, but can tolerate much wetter soils. So another thing, in addition to plant lists, is knowing just basic cultural information that's going to help you out. If you're in Zone 7 South, and I used to say the Mason-Dixon line, I'm a Virginia guy, so I'm right on that Mason-Dixon line, but really it's more of a Zone 7. The best time to plant a tree or a shrub and many perennials is going to be in the fall. And that's because our soils don't freeze south of Zone 7 generally in most years, and so you get active root growth even though the canopy or the top of that plant above the soil line is dormant. Below the soil line, it's still actively growing, and it is establishing over the winter months that have much less environmental stress, particularly heat and drought. And by planting in the fall, you are giving that plant a head start going into the next active growing season, which is generally 4 to 6 months away. Container grown shrubs can be planted throughout the year, though. Balled and burlapped, and this is a misconception with a lot of people. Balled and burlap, generally deciduous trees, things like oaks and maples and tulip poplars, are going to be planted from November to February. And a lot of people think that that's all of them, but there's actually things like southern magnolia, osmanthus. There are a lot of your broadleaf evergreen trees that go through a summer dormancy period, and it's usually July, August. They can be dug and planted at that time as well. And a lot of people don't necessarily take advantage of this, but it can be done. But planting at the right time of the year is critical in actually having that plant established when it is in a dormant state, and therefore can go into the next active growth period with at least a small amount of new root growth, because the key is just get the root zone established. Another thing that people don't do, which I'm always amazed at, and the canopy of two plants in pots may look exactly the same. There's a study that was done out of Texas A&M that people spend more time picking a plant than they do, or picking plants for landscapes, and this was master gardener type folks, than they do purchasing a vehicle. So the decision on which plant to buy takes longer than which car I'm going to buy, which I think is amazing. But at the same time, if you walk through a garden center or you look at a landscape contractor who buys in plants, nobody actually pulls the plant out of the pot to look at the roots. And it really is amazing to me that you'll spend so much time making a decision, and yet you don't look at the product thoroughly, because all the action and all the potential troubleshooting type issues are in the root zone, much more so than they are in the canopy. Things like circling roots or dead or dying roots. If you look at this picture, the plant over here on the right hand side, nice roots, healthy roots. The plant on the left most likely has some kind of a root disease, or it could be heat damage to the root system, but has black roots, not a lot of new root growth. You get a couple of root initials here, but generally the root zone doesn't look nearly as well. So that's the issue that you have to deal with. If you purchase a plant, you're going to be dealing, if it's disease, with that disease forever. If you have major circling roots, you're either going to have to rectify that before planting by cutting these large circling roots, or you're going to have to deal with that issue in perpetuity, which may eventually, if it's a tree, kill a tree. Other things, planting depth. One of the biggest troubleshooting issues that I see on plants that, and this is particularly true in commercial landscapes, and city tree plantings and so on and so forth, is the fact that the hole, particularly if it's dug with a tree spade, large holes, they're not hand dug, tend to be the wrong depth. They're either too shallow, so the root ball is above grade, above the ground level, and that causes it to dry out quicker, and then you get drought stress and injury, or too low. And if it's too low, then the issue you're going to see is the same thing that you see here in the bottom right, okay? You're going to get this layered root system, and eventually that's going to cause that plant to fail. The easiest thing to do when you're planting to get the proper rooting depth is just take a shovel handle and put it across the hole. Obviously, you want the hole to be dug twice as wide as the root ball, okay? And that's kind of an accepted, and you do that so that the plant has a nice cultivated area to initially start that root growth. One thing that I see constantly, and I took a picture of this in Atlanta about 2 weeks ago, and I forgot to put it in here, is remove the, particularly ball and burlap, remove the string from around the stem of the tree or shrub, please. Otherwise, you might get ridiculed by somebody like me. But the city of Atlanta has large planters right downtown, and they have Burford holly in them, and there's probably 50 of them, and they're all still have the wires around them, and they're starting to fail. And it amazes me. Now, another question is to remove the burlap and wire basket or not. And research has shown that it doesn't matter, okay? What does matter is that you remove that wire or that string from around the stem. Cut it off, remove it. But actually removing the burlap does not harm nor help the plant in the long run. Removing the wire basket doesn't harm or help the plant in the long term. Generally speaking, in Georgia, with our rainfall rates, that burlap is going to degrade in roughly 4 months, and the roots can actually penetrate through the burlap anyway. So it's not an inhibitor for root growth. Another question that gets frequently asked is, should you cut the root ball or not cut the root ball? From a troubleshooting perspective, if you have large circling roots, you do want to remove those, because circling roots, particularly on a tree, in the long term can cause that tree to fail. However, shrubs and trees, just cutting the root ball, it does not help or hurt the plant. Tim Smalley, a colleague of mine at University of Georgia, had a graduate student who did work with boxwood and Japanese holly and a few other species, and they would cut the root ball or not cut the root ball and then plant them in the field, and there was no difference in growth rate. And I'll leave it up to Gene. I'll pose this to Gene. I would think that actually cutting the root ball would actually make the plant more susceptible to disease issue because you have all that damaged tissue, but I will leave that one up to Gene to answer. Another misconception with trees and shrubs is to amend the planting hole. From a troubleshooting perspective, there is no need to amend the planting hole, okay? If you have a large landscape, so let's say you have a 500 square foot bed that you're going to be planting and you'd like to amend a larger area, that's okay. But amending a single hole, if you're planting a tree or a shrub, can actually do more harm than good. And the reason why is because I'll use the example of a clay soil. If you have a clay soil, almost any amendment you use, including mushroom compost and fine textured amendments, even those are going to be larger particle size than the clay around it. So what's going to happen there is you're going to have water that's wicked away from the root ball, okay? And you can get a planting hole that has amendment in it that's drier than the surrounding soil. that can cause that plant to be drought stressed when a homeowner or a landscape contractor looks at the landscape as well and says, well, it looks like it's well irrigated. The turf might look good, existing trees and shrubs may look good, and you have this one plant that somehow seems like it's drought stressed. It might be flagging or wilting. That can be an issue. On the other hand, let's say you're in a sandy soil. Let's see if I can erase this real quick. Good job. So if you're in a sandy soil, almost all of your compost base are going to have a finer texture than the sand in which is the surrounding soil. And in this case, the water will be wicked into, the water always wants to go to a smaller particle size. Okay, so in this case, it'll be wicked from the sandy soil into that amendment around your planting hole, and you can actually have a waterlogged environment within your planting hole or planting zone or root zone, which can lead to root disease. So you got to be careful when you're doing these things. And single holes, you generally do not want to amend. A lot of people like to use these water saucers. I see oodles of trees, particularly in landscapes, that have these water saucers. What's going to happen with time is that half of this soil is going to go this way, but half of it is going to go back into the hole. And what you're going to do is you're going to essentially have a altered planting depth as that soil goes back into this water saucer. So I do not recommend using these water saucers. They're nice, but in the end, what they can do is they can cause the planting depth to be artificially changed or with time change, and then you can get stem rot and tree failure. It's particularly true on shade trees. It amazes me. Well, I should say it doesn't amaze me anymore, but I still am shocked at how many guy wires get left on trees for years and years and years, particularly in parking lots. We have a new Super Kroger close to my house, and it's been there for 2 years. And almost every time I go to the parking lot, I see a different tree that still has guy wires on it from a planting 2 years ago. Well, the structural integrity of that tree is going to be compromised because essentially what you're doing is you're strangling the tree. So from a troubleshooting perspective, 2 to 3 months after the tree is planted, just remove it. By then, the tree should be established enough that it's not going to blow over. Some basic fertilization issues. I don't go through all of fertilization. That would be a talk in and of itself. But there's constantly an issue with people asking or questioning, should they use general purpose fertilizer, what we call an ag grade fertilizer, like 10-10-10. There's no controlled release to these products, or slow release or controlled release fertilizer. Usually the ratio of NP and K in these is 3:1:2. So 3 parts N, 1 part P, 2 parts K. Organic. Should you use organic? Most organics are not necessarily slow release, and they generally cost anywhere from 10 to 50 times more than a conventional fertilizer by weight, or liquid. So which fertilizer should be used? A lot of people consider cost, and that's why most people use ag grade fertilizer, which doesn't necessarily have a release period. Generally, when you put down these products like 10-10-10, you have about 10 to 12 weeks in a sandy soil and about 16 weeks in a clay soil before that product is gone, which could lead to additional fertilizations, or could, in some cases, particularly sandy soils, could lead to nutrient deficiencies late in the season. You really see this a lot in sandy soils when it comes to calcium and magnesium being deficient late in the season, and that's because you might put down a conventional fertilizer or micronutrient package in the spring, and in that sandy soil it washes through so fast that that it doesn't make it to the end of the season. So for that reason, generally what we do is we recommend a controlled release product, particularly in sandy soils. In a clay soil, We also recommend it, but it's not as critical as it is in a sandy soil to maintain good nutrient availability through the season. A lot of people also debate the point of should you use things like these tree spikes that you see in the top picture, or these what I call aggregate products. Generally, no, you do not want to use that, because where you put a tree spike or one of these aggregate products is where the roots are going to grow. So you are dictating where root growth occurs. The problem happens when there's a drought, and in those cases, you're going to have tree roots that are very isolated. If you use what I call a dispersed product, a granular product that you broadcast over an area, you actually force the roots to grow a wider surface area, and because of that, they're less prone to damage in dry conditions and drought stress conditions. Another question that I frequently get is, where do you fertilize a plant during the planting process? And Jim Owen at Virginia Tech has done a lot of research with this, and the best thing is what he calls dibbling. So the general way that most people fertilize is you plant the plant and then you put fertilizer on top of the soil surface after you've planted the shrub or tree or perennial or annual, although I don't talk too much about annuals. Research shows that the best thing for the plant's health is to put the fertilizer in the bottom of the planting hole. The reason why is because you're going to force roots to grow downward toward the fertilizer that's in the substrate. And because you're doing that, you're forcing those roots to grow deeper, so they're more drought tolerant in dry conditions or dry periods. You can also come back and fertilize on the top of the soil if you'd like, but putting some 50%, in some cases 100% of that fertilizer planting in the bottom of the planting hole is going to help that plant in the long term be more healthy and establish better. Okay, now when we talk about when to fertilize, so most people fertilize, most homeowners, research has shown, will fertilize twice a year. And they fertilize in the spring and they fertilize in the fall. Okay, and I don't speak to turf grass because I'm not a turf guy. Patrick McCullough is going to be speaking to you later in the year, and he's the perfect person to ask about fertilization of turf grass. But trees and shrubs and perennials as well, you do not want to fertilize in the fall. Okay, the reason why, if you look at this, is that in the fall, when we get into September and October, nutrient use is dropping. Okay, the plant is going dormant. If we fertilize that plant really after July, we are going to cause that plant to have a secondary growth flush. That growth is much more prone to cold damage when we get our first frost or first freeze in this November to early December period. We want the fertility to be low going into the fall, not high. Okay, so when do we want to fertilize? Well, we want to fertilize, and if you look at the trees and shrubs, particularly in your landscape, but perennials as well, you want to fertilize when the buds are swelling. This is when the sap is rising, and we want our fertilizer to be available during that period. If you fertilize once the foliage starts to emerge or new growth starts to emerge, you're actually fertilizing too late. So we want to look, and what I always do, even though I don't like them very much, I always look up at the sweet gums. And when I see the buds on sweet gums swelling, it's time when I fertilize. And it tends to work out very well. Sweet gums are relatively early in bud swell, and they're very visible when the buds do start to swell. But that's the time when we want to fertilize. Certainly not later in the season, because if we fertilize too late, you will have higher degree of cold damage to your landscape trees and shrubs. So, talked about fertilizer frequency. Always look at a soil test. one of the biggest troubleshooting issues that I get, I have pictures every year of this. Generally, it's on new growth, and generally it's in the spring. And this is a picture of an azalea. This is actually in a commercial nursery, but the same would hold true for a landscape. Anybody want to guess what this is? It took me a while the first time I got a picture of this. I said, well, there must be an insect damage or a disease, something going on. It's actually fertilizer burn. In this case, a conventional fertilizer, but the same would hold true for a slow release, was applied to the plants in the morning while they were still dew on the foliage. The salt from the fertilizer pellet or prill burned the new growth. Okay? Do not fertilize when the foliage is wet, or you will see some form or fashion of damage, particularly that new growth or the growing tips of those plants. And once that's damaged, then you can get a secondary infection or insect damage, insects that come in to basically finish off the plant. Another thing with fertilizing, this is particularly true with trees, is where do you actually put the fertilizer? There's a misconception that you should fertilize, and a lot of people fertilize in this area under the canopy of the tree. There's actually very little good that comes from fertilizing the canopy of a tree, because most of your roots under the canopy are structural roots. They're not feeder roots. Most of your feeder roots are from the edge of the canopy outward 2 to 3 times the diameter of the canopy. So if you look at if you stand under a tree and you look up and you say the canopy is 20 foot wide, you want to be fertilizing from that canopy outward 20 to 40 more feet, because that's where the feeder roots are. The other thing you're doing there is you're forcing that tree to expand its root system, or shrub to expand its root system, and because of that, you're going to have a healthier tree or shrub. Talk real quick about irrigation. A lot of the troubleshooting issues that revolve around irrigation in the state of Georgia are based upon timing of irrigation issues and quantity of irrigation. When it comes to quantity, there are many things you can do now. One technology that I really like are soil moisture sensors. There are a number of companies now. The one that you see on the screen here is an Acclima-based system. But essentially what they do is they continuously monitor soil moisture and only irrigate when soil moisture drops below a certain threshold. For example, in a clay soil, that's usually around 20% soil moisture is where we start to see plants a little bit water stressed. In the case of a sandy soil, it's more like 15 to 17% where we start seeing some moisture stress. So we try to use these technologies, and in this case, it can reduce your irrigation by 80%. But what it also does is it only provides water to the plant when it needs it. So you generally don't have as much drought stress, but also not nearly as much moisture stress. And moisture stress can be an issue in irrigated landscapes. If you've ever gone by a bank, and banks are always notorious for irrigating when it's raining, you can see why you can have moisture stress. And it's particularly true to turf, but also to some trees and shrubs. Another thing is ET-based controllers. This is evapotranspiration. Again, in this case, that calculates how much water was lost the previous day based upon evaporation from the soil and transpiration from the plant, and it only irrigates to replace the moisture that was lost, okay? And it takes into account rainfall. So if it rained and it doesn't need irrigation the next day, it won't irrigate. The other thing is a lot of city ordinances and state ordinances around the southeastern United States and really across the United States say the best time to water is between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. Well, okay, that's a nice 12-hour window, but really for disease management in particular, you really want to be irrigating as close to sunrise as you can, because the point is to reduce that foliage wetness as much as possible. How much to water? There are people who say water every day. There are others who say water infrequently. But if you can water less frequently but longer durations, okay? So instead of watering 15 minutes daily, water 45 minutes once a week. And literally once a week is fine for most landscape trees and shrubs. Maybe not color, but for trees and shrubs certainly. But a longer duration irrigation event, you're going to have deeper penetration of your moisture, and therefore you're going to have root zones that want to go deeper, because between irrigation events, they're going to be searching for water. If you consistently irrigate on a daily basis but don't irrigate frequently, you're going to have a very shallow root system that is not going to be nearly as tolerant to dry conditions. Real quick, I'll talk about pruning. The troubleshooting issues that revolve around pruning have to deal with using the wrong tool, because you can do more damage than good. Using the wrong technique, again, if you use the wrong technique, you can cause more damage. And then pruning at the right time. So generally, never use anvil cut, because what you're doing is you're crushing the stem of the plant that you're pruning, and it is a perfect place for disease or insects to become established. Scissor cut you want to use, but nothing over about a 1/2 inch diameter. If you're under a 1/2 inch, you can use your scissor cut hand pruners. A 1/2 inch to just about an inch, you would want to use loppers. Anything greater than an inch in diameter, you should really be using a handsaw or something a little more powerful. Just a variety of handsaws. I like collecting them. Pole pruners. Just because it's a bigger piece of equipment doesn't mean you can cut a larger diameter. On a pole pruner, it's still roughly the same diameter as a pair of hand pruners. You shouldn't be cutting anything greater than a 1/2 inch diameter with most pole pruners. Anything greater than a 1/2 inch, you probably want to be using a saw. Why do you prune? You want to improve the function, you want to improve bloom, you want to improve the form of the plant. Those are the main reasons. One thing that we do, and I see this constantly, is we don't understand the plant we're pruning, and because of that, we create a disaster. For example, you never want to prune a conifer greater than past the second year's growth. And if you do that, past the second year's growth, you're going to end up with a Charlie Brown Christmas tree, because it's not going to break bud. So really, you just want to be tip pruning these conifers to improve the shape of the tree, if you prune them at all. And boxwood is another one that falls into that category. You don't want to be pruning back past the second year's growth. When we're talking about pruning, particularly deciduous trees is where I see this problem. The whole goal is to create a good structure by having a central leader. I mean, you can tip prune, you can do anything you want, but the critical thing with deciduous trees in particular is to maintain a central leader. And I throw all these in there. You'll have this PowerPoint that you can look at later, but these are just different strategies. And I'll walk through a lot of these in the next few slides. So one of the issues in the landscape is that there's no competition for light. In a forest, you walk through the forest, there's competition for light, so you get all of these single trunk or leader trees. In a field situation or a landscape situation, you have what's called codominant leaders. Codominant leaders, where they meet, this crotch area, okay, is going to be extremely weak, and that will fail eventually. And that's generally what's going to kill most of our landscape trees at one point or another, is a crotch failure due to a lack of good structural integrity. This can be solved pretty easy when the tree is young. So this is from a friend of mine at University of Florida, Ed Gilman. This is a live oak. This is something that if it were pruned when it was 2 or 3 years old, it wouldn't have this giant codominant leader situation. And When Hurricane Charlie came through there, which was about 5, 6, 7 years ago, this was a result of that codominant leader. And they lost a lot of trees on campus. And I will say that universities are a prime example, generally, of how not to prune trees. So do as we say, not as we do. The whole point and purpose of codominant leaders and trying to keep one central leader is that when we have a central leader, one trunk, then our branches are going to be coming out from that central leader, central trunk, at roughly perpendicular angles. Okay, versus if we have codominant leaders, it's a very narrow crotch, and that puts stress on both of these branches or both of the leaders, which is going to be a fail point. Perpendicular, or as close to perpendicular as possible, is going to be much healthier for the tree and much more structurally sound. This is just another one. This is in Tifton, as I affectionately call Tiff Vegas. It's the hottest place I've ever been in my life, including Las Vegas. But you can see here, this is another tree to remedy the problem of codominant leaders or two competing trunks. You have that there, and then you have another one further up the tree. They had to make a very large, about 8-inch cut to this to remove one of them. This large of a cut is going to cause that tree to fail. Okay. Generally, you don't want to be making cuts to trees that are greater than 2 inches, and that's in most all cases. What's going to happen is you're going to get rot through this cut, which is going to go down into the trunk of the tree, the wood of the tree, and cause a weakening of that trunk. So a lot of trees that you see that aren't necessarily blown over in a storm, but snap somewhere along the base here, are because you have a limb that failed or was removed, and you have rot in the tree, and that rot takes out the wood and causes a weak point. So long term, that's not going to work well. When do you do this? Really, it's the majority of this and the majority of trees, I say the first 7 years. And 7 years is a good to remember because that's how long you're supposed to keep your taxes and other things. But 7 years, if you're pruning a tree and you do it consistently for 7 years, generally you have gotten the tree, and the tree will be trained to have that central leader. You can carry that forward there to almost 20 years, but really it's through the juvenility period of that tree that you want to be maintaining the central leader. I'll move through real quick. The other thing that you want to do to maintain the structural integrity of that tree or shrub is always make your cuts outside of what's called the branch collar. This is a meristematic region. You see that dark right here. If you cut inside of this, then it cannot callus over, and you will get rot down into the wood of the tree, which is this lighter color here. That's what we consider the wood of the tree versus the cambium that's along the outside. So always make your cuts outside of the branch collar. This is Longwood Gardens, which is probably one of the best known gardens in the public gardens in the world. A great example. These are Paulwinia trees. They had an alley of them that my hurricane namesake, Hurricane Matthew, took out. They had these large cuts that were made, and these were made in the 80s. Never healed over. The rot went into the trunk of the tree, and when Hurricane Matthew came through, that was the end of that. So when it comes to trees, also understanding trees respond, particularly trees, but shrubs as well, respond differently. Different species respond differently to pruning, particularly how large of a pruning cut you can make. Something that is a good compartmentalizer, compartmentalizing means that it heal itself quickly and not have rot that progresses down into the trunk of the tree. So in this case, you can make a 2 to 4 inch pruning cut with minimal rot into the trunk of the tree. Things like white oak, walnut, red oak, taxus, and a lot of your elms, most of your elms. Things that are poor compartmentalizers are trees that if you make a 1 to 2 inch cut, you actually get rot into the trunk of the tree. Okay, so a much smaller cut actually leads to much more damage. Things like horse chestnut, red maple, beech, shoe-marred oak, and poplar. Okay, so if you're going to be putting a tree into a landscape and you know that you're not going to prune this but maybe once every 3 to 4 years, you probably want to pick a tree that is a good compartmentalizer, because by the time you get around to pruning that tree every 2 to 3 years, you're probably going to have to be making larger pruning cuts. So this is just an example real quick of, and I'm skipping a few slides just for time's sake, but also you want to make sure you have the proper cut in order to, proper pruning cut when you do make cuts, so that you minimize the damage to the tree. So in this case, the right way to make a pruning cut is depicted here in A. You're about a 1/2 inch between your pruning cut and the bud, the closest bud, so you get a little bit of dieback, and then this bud will break, okay, and then this bud will most likely break, so you'll get future growth. If you make it at too steep of an angle, you just have a larger surface area that's susceptible to disease or infection. If you make it too far away from the bud, you get more dieback, okay, which is mainly an aesthetic issue, but it can also be a disease issue. And if you make it too close to the adjacent bud, most likely this bud is going to die, and then you'll have dieback all the way down to the next closest bud. So you really want to be about a 1/2 inch from the bud below, and want to make it at just enough of an angle that it sheds water, and no more than that. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about is when pruning is maintaining this radial symmetry to a tree. And this is a tree that Dr. Gary Knox at the University of Florida Quincy Research Station has been pruning on, I think now for 25 or more years, which was very interesting and I think it was Hurricane Rita came through there. On their research station, they lost almost all the trees that they had. This tree, which was in the middle of a field, took a 100-mile-an-hour wind perfectly fine. And the thought is that with radial symmetry, the tree is much more balanced weight-wise and able to hold up to high wind situations. So that's the reason why we want to have this radial symmetry. Again, this is something that gets accomplished when the tree is in the juvenile phase. So we're not talking about going out and pruning a mature 40-foot tall tree. We're talking about creating this symmetry when that tree is 1 to 7 to 10 years old. And after that point, it tends to take care of itself. So removing a large branch, or what I call a jump cut, go through this real quick because it's a problem that I see frequently. It's a 3-cut process. The first cut is under the tree, halfway through the large branch, and we're talking 5-6 inch here. The second cut is made halfway through, or through the top, about 6 inches from the first cut, 6 inches outward from the first cut. As you make this cut, generally what's going to happen is the bark will strip back to the first cut. If you don't make the first cut, the bark will strip back as you make this cut, all the way generally past the point where you're going to have damage down the trunk of the tree. Let's show you this real quick in pictures. So the first cut, halfway through, starting from the bottom of the branch, okay, and then you come back on the outward side of that about 6 inches through the top, make your second cut, and that'll generally break back to the first cut point and stop. And you can see that in this bottom left picture right here, what it looks like. And then you can come back through on the outside of your branch collar and make your third cut, now that the weight has been taken off of that branch. I see so many times, and you will walk through landscapes and you'll see these trees that are mature trees that have this area where the bark looks like somebody ran into it, but it's 8 feet off the ground. But it looks very much like a lawnmower ran into the tree. That's generally because somebody made this pruning cut, not using a jump cut, and it ripped the bark down the side of the tree. And that's a tree that will fail with time. Again, pruning conifers, you only want to tip prune. So you can see here, I tried to depict this. This is current year's growth, and this is generally second year's growth down to where you get a branch point. If you cut below the second year's growth in here, you're not going to get regrowth. Generally, you want to tip prune. Most people tip prune somewhere in the current year's growth, and that's all that you can do with conifers. Spring versus summer flowering, get this call all the time. You want to prune a spring flowering plant after it blooms. And by spring flowering, I generally mean in the literal sense. The first day of summer, I consider summer flowering. Anything from there onward, which I believe is June 21st, you're going to prune those before new growth begins in the spring. Okay, so if you prune a spring flowering plant before it blooms, obviously it's not going to bloom. And every year I get questions, and particularly on azaleas. I don't have any blooms on my azaleas. Well, or I have significantly reduced blooms on my azaleas. Another one is hydrangea. My hydrangea is not blooming. If it's one of the older style hydrangeas not reblooming, the reason why is you've pruned the flowers off. Just a few other things that you have to deal with when it comes to troubleshooting. Almost all of these are human induced, and I can teach you about these things because I have done all of them. I have killed trees by parking on the root system, guilty as charged. I have accidentally left a gas can that had a leak in it under a tree and killed a tree with gas. I have trenched next to a tree, not by desire, but out of necessity, and killed a tree and a shrub in that case. I have run into a tree, backed into a tree with my pickup truck, and damaged the trunk of the tree and caused it to die. So almost all of these things are human caused and can be avoided. It's just understanding your surroundings, particularly when it comes to mechanical damage of trees and shrubs. I wanted to leave you with a few things on the IPM side. I'm not going to get too much into the IPM because that is much more Dr. Woodward's, Gene's specialty and not mine, but I did want to be able to give you some IPM resources. And most of your IPM or integrated pest management resources are also going to be very good cultural information as well. Most of these talk about, in addition to insects and disease pressure, they'll talk about soil types and fertility and cold hardiness and cultivar differences if there's disease or insect tolerance differences. So use these guides. Some of them are plant specific and some of them are general. And I've thrown a few in here. This is a great one. This is out of University of Tennessee. What this deals with is pesticide rotations. You get information like these giant tables, but what it does is it allows you, from a troubleshooting perspective, one of the biggest issues, and Dr. Woodward might want to touch on this a little bit as well, but we don't want to build up resistance because that's one of the biggest troubleshooting issues we deal with. I'm certain everyone has heard of the whole Palmer amaranth being resistant to glyphosate. That's just one example of a chemical. If we don't rotate, we can build resistance, whether it's in weeds, in insects, or in diseases, and we don't want to do that. So chemical rotations are very important. Here's another one, IPM of southeastern trees. This is a book that was written or released in 2012, and it goes through IPM of the top 10 selling trees in the southeastern United States. It's also available as individual PDF files, and all of these are free. You don't have to pay for any of these resources that I'm telling you about. In this case, the chapters that are included, you can see them there. Like I say, top 10 selling trees in the southeastern United States, as well as an entire section on weed control. That's just one of the chapters. Another book that was released by the same group is on the top 5 selling shrubs in the southeastern United States. It was released in June of 2014. Some of the chapters, or the chapters that are included in the first book, are there. Then we had just released last month, or early this month, was the second IPM for Southeastern Shrubs book, which included 5 chapters. Hydrangea I'll try to remember them. Hydrangea loropetalum rhipholepsis, which is Indian hawthorn, ilex, and rhododendron. So 5 pretty big genus of plants. Another thing when it comes to troubleshooting plant problems is, and I am not a Twitter user, I must say, and I am gladly not a Twitter user or Instagram or Snapchat or any of the others, but as a grower, there are some outstanding resources, and this is one Stephen Frank at North Carolina State University uses. Communication when it comes to troubleshooting, particularly insect issues, can be extraordinary. And I love to give the example of Japanese beetles. Stephen Frank every year, and this is his blog, it's Eco IPM, based out of North Carolina State, but he will monitor the progress of pests throughout the southeastern United States. So he'll say, or one of his followers on Twitter will say, Japanese beetle has started in Tallahassee, Florida. And then somebody will say, yep, we've seen it in Macon. And then, even though Japanese beetle doesn't go that far south, I'm just using it as an example. And then Atlanta, Charlotte, Richmond, New York City, just right up the eastern seaboard. Another one that does affect most all of us is granulate ambrosia beetle, that also you can just watch its progression on this Twitter feed, which is live updates. So communication and these tools to communicate from a troubleshooting perspective can be invaluable. And he goes through probably 2 or 3 topics a week, and it covers landscapes, nurseries, and greenhouse. But it doesn't end there. There are other resources that are out there. This is a brand new resource out of North Carolina State. I believe Dr. Woodward, our second speaker, was one of the authors on this. This is an outstanding pest control guide as well. And then we've got another one that just recently came out that focuses on mites. And I know that particularly aerified mites are a huge issue in the southeastern United States, and one that there's not a lot of publications on. So I wanted you to know that. So I think I'm a little over. I apologize for that. If you'd like, I could answer questions now. I will leave that up to Dan if he wants me to hang out till the end.
Yeah, Matthew, this is fantastic talk. And for those of you who I know were writing like crazy, this webinar is going to be archived, so you'll be able to come back and watch it. Give us 2 or 3 weeks to clean up the archive, and you can come back to gtbop.com and you can rewatch this webinar. But yeah, I think we're going to have to hold off on questions, Matthew. And if anybody has a question for Matthew, you've got his email address and his phone number right there. That's his mobile number. You can go ahead and get a question for him either during the break or afterwards. But Matthew's fantastic stuff, just a ton of really good information. And thanks for the great talk. And I think we're going to take about a 3-minute break now, and go get yourself a cup of coffee and drink of water, and we'll see you in 3 minutes. Thanks, Matthew. Very good stuff.